We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Eric L. Muller. Eric L. Muller is George R. Ward Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has published articles in the Yale Law Journal, the Harvard Law Review, and the University of Chicago Law Review. He is the author of the book Free to Die for Their Country, the story of Japanese American draft resistors in World War II. And he is here to talk about his new book, American Inquisition, The Hunt for Japanese American Disloyalty in World War II. If you would start and tell us what was your motivation in writing American Inquisition?
Well, I've been working on the Japanese American internment and its legal history for over a decade now. As you mentioned, I wrote a book back in 2001 about the Japanese Americans who resisted the draft from within the internment camps to test the loyalty of the internment. And so that work got me deep inside the archives, principally in Washington, D.C. and College Park, Maryland, looking at the documentation of this very tragic episode in American history. And I began to learn something that I had not known and I think was not part of the literature about this period at all, which is that the program of internment was not simply a program that initially presumed that every Japanese American was disloyal and put them into camps, but that then very quickly moved into a phase of adjudicating on a case-by-case basis which of the American citizens in the camps were loyal to the United States and which were disloyal, and then taking various kinds of action as a consequence of that. And so I saw, as a legal historian, I saw a very important chapter in American legal history that had really gone unstudied, and that is the idea that even before the McCarthy period, which is, of course, the period that most people think of when they think of American loyalty testing, even before that period, the government was, in a sense, pioneering and piloting programs to decide which American citizens were loyal and which American citizens were disloyal during wartime. This seemed like an important piece of the story that had not yet gone examined, and so I decided to look into it, and that's what produced the book American Inquisition. It's a history of this process of loyalty, bureaucratic loyalty testing.
All right. Can you give us kind of a brief overview of the Japanese internment here in the U.S.?
Sure. This is obviously a subject of greater interest out here on the West Coast than it is back east where I teach and work at the University of North Carolina. The internment was a system of detention that was created in January into February of 1942, so a couple of months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, in which the federal government, deciding, as the commanding general said, that the Japanese race was an enemy race, those were his words, that all people of Japanese ancestry along the West Coast would need to be rounded up and forced out of their homes into detention. Initially, and this program actually began, one of the very first places was here in this area on Bainbridge Island, was one of the very first places that was evacuated. People were forced initially into so-called assembly centers, which were fairgrounds, racetracks, these sorts of public places where barracks could quickly be created. So the Japanese American population of the West Coast initially spent the summer of 1942 behind barbed wire in these so-called assembly centers. And then in the fall of 1942, everybody was all roughly 120,000 people were packaged up and put onto trains and shipped into the interior. And this was a program that affected every single person of Japanese ancestry, completely without regard for whether the person was an alien or whether the person was a U.S. citizen. As the commanding general, John DeWitt, had said, it was a racial question. The Japanese race was an enemy race. And so it didn't matter to the military whether a person was an American citizen or a Japanese citizen, Japanese alien. Everyone, if you were of Japanese ancestry, whether you were 1 month old or 95 years old, you were packed up and shipped off to the interior. To these 10 camps at the time, the language that was used by everybody, from the internees themselves all the way up to Franklin Roosevelt, was concentration camps. Obviously, that term has come to mean something different because of the camps in Europe at the same time, the Nazi death camps. And of course, these were not death camps. They were, however, called concentration camps. Their technical term, the euphemism you might say, was relocation centers. And there were 10 of them spread around the Mountain West, and 2 of them were actually as far east as Arkansas. So that's where everybody landed in the fall of 1942, and that's, in a sense, where my story picks up. There's been a great deal that's been written about the period between Pearl Harbor and the fall of 1942, how the federal government went about deciding to relocate and evacuate and incarcerate every person of Japanese ancestry. What the literature hasn't done is it hasn't really looked at what the government did once everybody got there. And it turns out that what the government needed to do very quickly, for a variety of reasons, was it needed to begin kind of breaking down that initial presumption that the Japanese race was an enemy race and that everybody was presumptively disloyal. And it needed to begin trying to do what it had not initially done, which was to look on a case-by-case basis at every single American citizen who was over the age of majority, and to decide whether each individual person was loyal or disloyal. And that's what my book does. It looks at this enormous bureaucracy that was created within several different federal agencies to process these people and decide what was it that made for a loyal American citizen.
Yeah, I should have said of Japanese ancestry. I said Japanese. So how did the government define loyalty?
Well, it's a fascinating study in bureaucracy, and everything that's, in a sense, everything that we tend to kind of mock and laugh about as bureaucrats manifested itself in this program. So the first thing the government did was it needed information. So it handed out, and in the camps, it actually went into the camps, sent military teams in, and forced everybody to fill out a form. It was a 4-page form called a registration questionnaire. And it was, in a sense, not too terribly different from the kind of form you might fill out if you were showing up for jury service today. Your education, where you're from, what your citizenship is, your educational background, what magazines do you read? And of course, obviously, then there were lots of questions that were keyed into Japanese cultural affiliation. How well did you speak Japanese? Could you read or write Japanese? Did you have relatives in Japan? Had you ever visited Japan? Did you read any Japanese language publications? Did you read the English language section of any Japanese American newspapers? Were you part of any clubs? Did you do sports? These sorts of things. And then finally, there were 2 questions at the very end of the form that were came to be called the loyalty questions. Questions 27 and 28 on the form asked the internees to say, first, whether they would agree to serve in the U.S. Army on combat duty wherever they were ordered to go. And the second question asked, will you agree to forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan and swear loyalty to the United States? Now remember, this question was being asked to American citizens who'd been born in the United States, the overwhelming majority of whom had never even been to Japan and had never sworn loyalty to the Emperor of Japan in the first place. So they were being asked to forswear a loyalty that they had never first sworn. Anyway, the government gathered all of these tens of thousands of forms, and then it had the classic problem. It had to process all of this information. It had these volumes of data about the Japanese American community, and it needed to turn all of that loose data into findings of loyalty and disloyalty. So what the government did was it brought in a statistician to come up with a method of turning all of this raw data into numbers, reducing these facts about Japanese Americans' cultural, religious, linguistic identities, and coding them for plus values and minus values. And so if it's okay, I can just take a second and tell you, just to give you a few examples of the kinds of ways in which these these volumes of raw data were converted into scores. So the government would have low-level bureaucrats go through the forms, and for each answer on the forms, people would get a plus value or a minus value. So, for example, if you were an instructor in a Japanese hobby or sport like judo, you would get a 2 minus. If you were an instructor in an American sport or an American hobby, you would get a 2 plus. And by the way, I'm reading directly from the form right now, so this is not, these are the terms that were used. For every Japanese or Japanese American publication or trade journal or magazine that you received, you'd get a 1 minus. If you were a Christian, you got a 2 plus. If you were a Buddhist, you got a 1 minus. If you were a Shintoist, you were rejected outright. If you had traveled to Japan once, you got a 1 minus. If you traveled to Japan twice, you got a 3 minus. If you were an instructor in a Japanese language school, you got a 2 minus. If you were a communist, you got a 2 minus. And so on and so forth. So you can see that what these forms were doing, or what this system was doing, is it was trying to take the most elemental components of religious identity, cultural affiliation, familiarity with Japanese society, and turning them directly into a coded system of loyalty and disloyalty. And I'll just take a second then, just to give you an idea of how this system operated. I want to describe for you somebody who was more or less a typical American citizen of Japanese ancestry from that time. Somebody who, a young guy, maybe early 20s, American citizen born in the United States to alien parents, never visited Japan, spoke Japanese only poorly, or let's say maybe visited Japan once as a young child to visit grandparents, let's say. Maybe went to a Japanese after-school program in the United States for a few years to learn a little bit of Japanese, just the same way that I might today send my kids to Sunday school or Hebrew school or something. Let's say the person had gone only to American schools all the way through. Let's say the person had a sister who was in Japan and a brother who was in the U.S. Army, agricultural worker, and maybe read the English language section of the local Japanese American paper. That person, under the military's coding system, would have received a negative loyalty score, a -2. The person that I just described to you, their net score would have been a -2. Wouldn't have mattered if the person had won a contest in their high school here in Seattle for the most moving rendition of the Gettysburg Address. Made no difference. It was simply a function of plus and minus values on these scores. So that'll give you some idea of how deeply suspicious this system was and how quick it was to convert and confuse the idea of Japanese culture with loyalty or disloyalty to the United States. The two things, in a sense, almost became merged into one for the purpose of this bureaucracy.
So that after taking this, there was no further communication with the individuals that took it?
Well, the military actually was of the view that there was no purpose to be served in actually directly interviewing the subjects themselves, because the military's view was that Japanese Americans couldn't be trusted, and therefore there was nothing to be gained from a system of hearings. There was another agency that was doing these loyalty testing procedures as well, and it was a civilian agency. It was called the War Relocation Authority, or WRA. This was the civilian agency that was created by the federal government in 1942 to actually run the camps, the 10 internment camps. So this was, as I say, a civilian agency. They were running their own loyalty screening systems because they were trying to do a couple of things. The War Relocation Authority, which was running these camps, was also running a program called Relocation, which is where they began trying to encourage and almost to force Japanese Americans to leave the camps and to relocate into communities in the interior of the United States, Des Moines, Iowa. It was a program of scattering the Japanese American population of the West Coast across the middle of the country. In order to do that, the War Relocation Authority needed to be able to go to the people in Des Moines, Iowa, and say, look, these Japanese Americans that we are putting into your communities are loyal. You can trust them. So they needed to do a loyalty screening system in order to be able to say to Middle America, these are loyal folks that we're leaving out of the camps. And at the same time, the War Relocation Authority was running a program that came to be called segregation, which was they took one of the 10 camps and they converted it into a much more repressive, almost a kind of lockdown confinement for the people that the War Relocation Authority deemed their bad apples, the people who were the most difficult to manage in the other camps, the people who were either of the most suspect loyalty or the people who were simply the most difficult to manage. They were sent off to the Tule Lake Segregation Center, which is in California. And so the way people got sent to that camp was also, again, through a process of internal loyalty screening. The War Relocation Authority was considerably more, I guess you might say, progressive in its views about the Japanese American community than the military agencies were. And so the War Relocation Authority did actually follow up these forms and these coding numerical systems with individual interviews with the internees in the camps. They would sit down, they would have each camp would have a little loyalty board of War Relocation Authority employees, white people, who would sit down with the internees and interview them for a half hour, 45 minutes about their, the same kinds of materials that had been covered in the forms. And they would then make a recommendation as to whether the person was loyal and should be allowed to leave camp, or whether the person was so disloyal that they should be sent off to this more intense confinement at Tule Lake. As I say, this was a more enlightened system by comparison to the military loyalty screening systems that were also being used at the time. But it was certainly it was no enlightened system at all, because while it was easier for the War Relocation Authority to entertain the idea that a Japanese American might be loyal, it was also nonetheless the case, and the archival record makes this very clear, that the War Relocation Authority was, under the guise of making a finding about loyalty or disloyalty, was actually in the process of trying to determine which internees could be beneficially released from the camps. And by beneficial, I mean who was a safe bet, who would be a good person to go out to Des Moines, Iowa and work in a factory, or who, in other words, would polish and burnish the image of the War Relocation Authority and its program of confinement and release. This is very clear in the documents. The forms that the War Relocation Authority officials had to fill out after they had sat down and interviewed a Japanese American required them to say, for example, was the release of this person beneficial for public relations? That's a direct quote from the forms themselves. And so what that shows is that this was a system in which government officials were being asked to decide whether American citizens of Japanese ancestry needed to be confined behind barbed wire, or I should say needed to continue to be confined rather than released, in order to bolster the public relations program of a federal government agency. So there was a lot more going on in these programs than a simple investigation of loyalty and disloyalty. There was instead politics, a whole lot of politics, in which agencies were trying to advance the ball of their own bureaucratic agendas and their own political missions. In fact, my argument in the book is that these systems really were not ultimately investigations into anything like the real loyalties of Japanese Americans at all. They instead very quickly became a kind of screen, a kind of blank screen onto which the investigating agencies basically projected their own racial and political suppositions about who Japanese Americans were and about what the military and the civilian bureaucracies needed to accomplish during wartime. That's ultimately the claim of the book. This was not a loyalty screening system at all. It was a blank screen onto which the government basically projected itself and its own fears and its own needs.
Was there any other groups that had to go through this type of questionnaire during the Second World War?
There were no other groups of American citizens who were subjected to these loyalty questionnaires at all. And this is a very important point. It's often said, and accurately said, that people must remember that the government's programs during World War II reached beyond Japanese Americans and also affected people of German ancestry and Italian ancestry. And that's absolutely true. And there's an important story that remains to be told that historians and the federal government really have not looked at about the ways in which the government interned Germans and Italians during the war in much smaller numbers than the Japanese Americans. So that's an important story that needs to be examined and told. But it's very important to note that those programs directed at Germans and Italians were overwhelmingly, although not exclusively, but overwhelmingly focused on aliens, on the idea that that Germans and Italians were enemy aliens, and therefore that it was appropriate during wartime, the claim was that it was appropriate during wartime, selectively to intern German aliens and Italian aliens. What the government didn't do was it didn't breach that line or that wall between aliens and citizens and bring to bear a program, a mass program of suspecting the loyalty of Italian American citizens and German American citizens, right? So Joe DiMaggio, Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, these people were not subjected to race-based or ethnicity-based programs of suspecting their loyalty. Japanese Americans along the West Coast, American citizens of Japanese ancestry, were subjected to these programs. So that's the central difference. So yes, the answer is a little complicated. Yes, there were programs that reached beyond Japanese Americans, but there were no mass programs suspecting the loyalty of any American citizen other than American citizens of Japanese ancestry.
So what happened to the people that failed this loyalty test both during the war and after the war?
Well, it's an interesting question. There were different things that happened to them depending on which agency was doing the testing. The War Relocation Authority, as I said, was doing this testing, and if you failed the loyalty test for the WRA, it depended a little bit how you failed. And I don't have time to go into the details on that, but one of two things would happen. You would either stay in the camp where you were, let's say the Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming or Minidoka in Idaho, which is where a lot of the Seattle Japanese American community was sent. Or if you were subject to an adverse finding by the WRA, you would be sent to this Tule Lake camp in California, which was a much unhappier and more repressive place. If you were found disloyal by the Provost Marshal General's office of the military, you would be barred from any kind of employment in any industry in the United States that was deemed in any way militarily sensitive. So making tires for Jeeps or the metal casings for ammunition or what have you. You'd be barred from those jobs. Then finally, at the end of the war, or as the war went down in late 44 into 1945, the government lifted the program of mass exclusion and replaced it with a system of individual exclusion. So the idea here was the camps were going to close, Japanese Americans could come back to the West Coast, but some Japanese Americans would still have to stay out. This was a program of individual exclusion that was run from late 1944 until the end of the war in September of 1945. So that was another loyalty system that was created by the Western Defense Command. And if you were found disloyal by the Western Defense Command, then you had to stay out of the West Coast when the rest of your family was coming back to Seattle. So it really depended on which agency was doing the testing and at what point in the war. Different things could happen to you at different points in time. I should note, by the way, that last program, the one that I just described, the program late in the war, from 44 through September of 45, that was the one loyalty screening program that ended up getting tested in federal court in Los Angeles. A dentist from Oakland, a Japanese American, decided to test this program in court. And the case was a case called Ochakubo versus Bonesteel. And it's a case that most people haven't heard of, unlike the most famous Japanese American case, the Korematsu case, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. Don't have enough time to tell you about the Ochakubo case today. I write about it in the book, though. And the bottom line here is that military witnesses came into a federal district court and lied their pants off, perjured themselves in order to try to get the federal judge to approve of this system of loyalty screening. The idea was that the military wanted a pronouncement from a federal judge that military officials could have unreviewable and unfettered discretion to relocate American citizens during wartime. They wanted that pronouncement, and they were willing to perjure themselves in court to get it. So anybody who's interested in hearing a good courtroom story might want to take a look at the last chapter of this book about the Ochakubo case.
Very quickly, do you see parallels between what happened with that program and what we're seeing today with the U.S. detentions, imprisonments in Guantanamo?
Well, it's a big question, and it would take me a long time to answer it fully. I guess the short answer is yes, I do see some parallels. There are obviously also very important differences. But some of I think the central parallel actually picks up on the point that I just made. We have seen since the Afghanistan military effort began, the federal executive repeatedly asserting the broadest possible claims of unreviewable executive power, and being repeatedly going into court, trying to get federal judges to declare Guantanamo to be a law-free zone and to keep the courts out. And this Ochakubo case, which I mentioned to you from 1945, is very reminiscent of the litigating strategies that the government is using today in order to try to create a system of military power and executive power that federal judges simply could not look behind. So yes, there are differences, but there are also parallels in the way that the government is trying to sustain claims of unreviewable executive power, and particularly to keep courts out of the picture.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in this morning.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for the time.
We have just been talking with Eric L. Muller. He is author of American Inquisition, The Hunt for Japanese American Disloyalty in World War II.